Welcome to another Waynos Fotos video, and this is another debunking video, and it's to do with an article which was put out by Cyclist, which says, are wider tyres and lower pressures faster? Now I don't want to pick on Cyclist because this seems to be a trend in the industry at the moment, but the way that they talk about everything in isolation and don't compare it holistically, to me is the big issue here. Well, let's roll that intro and let's get into it. So let's just start off by saying that when you have a rougher surface, a wider, lower pressure tyre will be faster. That I think is not disputed. But what I am disputing is if you go to a wider tyre and a lower pressure on the same surface, for example hot mix, you are not going to get any gain or any significant gain that's going to make any difference to your riding. First point, they talk about the contact patch. So what they're saying is when you go to a wider tyre at the same pressure as a skinnier tyre, the contact patch changes. It's the same area, but the contact patch on the wider tyre is more round and is actually deforming a smaller percentage of the tyre. And because you're deforming a smaller percentage of the tyre, then you have less energy loss. Now, I've discussed this in a previous video, and why this is really not relevant is because we're talking about the energy that the tyres are absorbing. But this is not the major factor when you're riding along. It's to do with the surface vibrations, and that's why the softer the casing or the thinner the casing, like we go to a high Fred TPI like a cotton tyre, which actually deforms easier, is faster, because what's happening is the casing that's stronger and harder and returning that energy is actually pushing the bike up and down, and you as the rider, and that's actually taking a lot more energy. So this I really completely reckon is completely debunked, and the reason why is also because they're saying at the same pressure, because when you ride a wider tyre you've got to run at a lower pressure. So comparing a 23mm tyre to a 28mm tyre at the same pressure really is not how you use them in real life. Now they give some examples of rolling resistance and what's equal. Now let me check my notes because I want to get the figures correct here. Now what they claim is a 20mm tyre at 160 psi is equal to a 28mm tyre at 80 psi. Now, there's a couple of things I just want to comment on this. First of all, as far as I'm aware, no clincher rim can go to 160 psi. It's just absurd. And 20mm tyres, which is kind of our old 19mm tyre, I don't think many people are riding them unless they're riding a retro bike. So I don't think that's a really good comparison. And what it actually does prove is, as far as pure rolling resistance goes, is a skinnier, higher pressure tyre does have a lower rolling resistance because they say it's equal to their wider tyre. So in reality, the only thing you're gaining there is comfort. You're not gaining any speed where they're saying it's faster. So debunked, even by their own data. Now they talk about comparison of tubeless tyres, which the two tubeless types of tyres we have are hookless, and the clincher tyres which have no tube in. Now they're saying that removing the tube removes another membrane in the tyre that adds to absorbing the energy. You need to take more energy to deform that tyre. Now the problem with this is that this again doesn't relate to the road surface, because what you actually want is you want a very supple casing. So as the tyre goes over the bumps and so forth, that soft casing, right, doesn't have any elasticity or rebound in it, so it's not being transferred to the rider and the bicycle trying to lift it, because that takes a lot of energy. And this is what also running at lower pressure does. You can actually make the casing more supple, or you can lower the pressure. So what they're saying here is that the tubeless and hookless are faster because the tube inside it takes more energy to deform, which is kind of the opposite. So what they do to compensate for that, they run the tyres wider and at a lower pressure. So really, it's not so much that they're faster because of they're wider. They're faster because their design parameters of the tyre are different. And the reason why this is because when you make a tubeless tyre and you make a hookless tyre, the sidewalls or the parts near where it affixed to the rim, they need to be able to not stretch. So they need to use materials in there that really haven't got any elasticity in them, because otherwise it would blow off the rim, and especially with a hookless rim. And they also have to lower the pressures in these type of tyres, because the casing of the tyre would have to be much stronger as the pressure goes higher, and then the tyre becomes a lot more heavier, then it becomes stiffer, and again you're going the wrong way. So yes, you can run a wider tyre at lower pressure. For hookless and tubeless, it is going to be faster, but I would like to see a test where they're comparing this to a cotton tyre, which has a very high thread TPI at a lower pressure, and I would probably say that you would get something very, very similar. So again, debunked, and I don't think that tubeless and especially hookless is a performance criteria that they're pushing. It's actually a manufacturing criteria they're pushing, because they're much, much easier to make, especially a hookless rim. But the tyres have to be made quite different to accommodate them. And because the casings have to be stiffer to get the same speed and suppleness, you have to go to a wider, lower pressure tyre. So yes, it's true what they're saying, but they're not comparing apples with apples. They compare apples and oranges. So if you compare a tubeless skinny tyre with a tubeless wider tyre, yes, it's going to be. But if you compare a tubeless or hookless tyre with, say, a tubular 23mm cotton casing, then I would probably say you'd have zero gains. And maybe I do believe that the tubular tyre would be faster if you played around with the pressures and the surface of the road you're riding on. Well, they also talked about the shape of the tyre. Now, when they talk about this shape, it only really applies to hookless or clincher type rims, because when you have a tyre that isn't a full circle, then as you go to a wider tyre, it bulges out. So you've got this like bulb or globe sitting on top of the rim. And they explain this, and this has been known for a long, long time, that you should match your tyre size to your rim size. You shouldn't put too big a tyre on. Mechanics and the industry hasn't talked about it much, but if you talk to an experienced, especially a classified UCI mechanic, they'll tell you shouldn't be putting, a 28 or 25mm on a rim that's designed for a 21, 23mm, because it changes the shape of the casing. Now, if you compare this to a tubular, it doesn't affect it because it's round. So what they're trying to do is they're trying to make a tyre that's like a globe into a circle, more of a circle, by making it more of a U shape. So what they're really trying to do is mimic the shape of a tubular, which we already have, and a tubular, no matter what size it is, it's always round. So this shape thing, yes, it applies to clinchers, but if you're comparing it to something like a tubular, which was considered the premium tyre, it's prettily a no argument. So that's debunked as well. Now let's just quickly talk about hookless rims. Now hookless rims, the way that they work is the tyre, or the part that fits onto the hookless part, is designed so it can't stretch. So they put some type of material in there so it can't expand. So when you put the tyre on the rim, it's held in. It can't get bigger to come off the rim. Now, of course, the more pressure you put on that, the more force is applied to these materials that are in the tyre that don't want to stretch. So it's putting them under load. So that part of the tyre can't really have much flex in it or movement in it. So you have to go to a wider tyre, right, at a lower pressure to be able to run these. And the ETRTO limit is 72 psi. Now, people like to say, who's this mob, this ERTRO? Sorry, ETRTO. It's just an organisation that manages guidelines, and people from the industry go on a discussion board and they talk about it, and then they write this guideline up. It's not really a standard, it's more of an industry guideline. But it's probably the better document to follow rather than a standard, because the standard, unfortunately, is much older and doesn't really talk about this newer technology. So it's good that they're referencing a more modern standard. But what it means is they need to design the tyres around a maximum PSI of 72 PSI. The manufacturers have said they do test them to 1.5 or 150% of the pressure, which is a safety margin, but reality is that you don't really want to go over 80 psi running a hookless rim. So to get the same ability of it to hold the weight, they need to have it wider and it needs to be a lower pressure. So that's a design parameter, not so much a performance parameter, which is being put on the tyre manufacturers so they can design these hookless rims. Now, in conclusion, these manufacturers are talking about a 28mm tyre for a 75 kilo guy running the tyres around about 80 psi, and you're going to get a beautiful fast ride. And my argument to that is that you can run narrower tyres at that sort of pressure, no problems. It's not like you're going to get, pinch flats on a clincher at that pressure. It's not like you're down at 60 psi or something silly. That's still quite a high pressure. Now, I am 85 kilos and usually ride with a backpack, so you can add like another 5 kilos. So that's 90 kilos. I'm running my tubular tyres, which are 23mm on the front at 80 psi and on the back on 90 psi, and it gives a beautiful, nice ride. And it's not that soft that it feels like the tyre's squishy in the corners or anything. So the pressures they're giving really can be related to narrower tyres. And if you're running 25mm tyres, no problems at that pressure. In fact, I could probably even run them a little bit lower. So this is where I think it's all debunked, because it's not like as if they're going to these really wide tyres and they're running them like, 50, 60 psi. I mean, obviously if it's a lighter rider, that varies it. But the real thing that changes the ability of the tyre to be fast is the road surface. And the width and pressure of the tyre needs to be tuned to that to get the ultimate fastest time. Now, the whole problem with that is, as I've mentioned before, is you have no control as a manufacturer, a tyre manufacturer, a rim designer, over the surface of the road. So if you're running on a smooth road, you can run a much narrower tyre and a higher pressure, and it'll be still just as fast as a wider tyre with a lower pressure. It's only when the road surface gets poor that the wider tyre at lower pressure starts to outperform the narrower tyre. So, if you, in the ultimate world, you could keep adjusting your tyres and changing your rims for where you're going to ride to get the fastest time. Now, the real twist here is they're claiming something like about 2 watts. And to get this 2 watts, you have to change your rim, you need to change your tyre, and in many cases you need to change your frame. So it's a very expensive exercise to get 2 watts. Now 2 watts, I know people realize, very, very small margin. You could change your sunglasses and get 2 watts. You could change the position on your hand, on your handlebars and get 2 watts. Riding in the drops will definitely give you more than 2 watts. Even changing your helmet could give you more than 2 watts. So it's a lot of torque and a lot of effort and a lot of changing your bike to get a very, very small advantage. And that's before we even talk about the aerodynamics and the design changes you need to do to the frame. Well, anyway, guys, that's where I'm going to leave it. And if you've got any comments or like to respond to that, or if you've read any of these articles, or even go and read this article, which is from Cyclist, which was put out just recently, 21st of June. And I'll actually put that down in the description if you want to go and read it. But that's where I'm going to leave it, guys, and I'll see you next vid. Don't rush out and buy wider tyres to save 2 watts, guys. That's what I'm trying to say to you.